Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. Tonight's story, The Choice in the Fields, by Brennaman. He had stopped running, but only because he couldn't run anymore. His foot had hit a stalk just at the perfect angle to leave him face first in the dry clumps of dirt that tore through his shirt, bloodied his elbows, and sprained his ankle. He'd found himself completely immobilized at the worst of times. He'd tried, twice, to get back on his feet, but there was no way. He'd heard the disgusting pop when he fell. He knew that he'd rolled his ankle, and in a bad way. He attempted to get up, twice, but both times he'd fallen with a whimper of pain. He pulled his foot towards him with a considerable effort, just to get a closer look at it. And to his dismay, it had already turned a deep red in color. There was no way he was going to get any further. He was stuck, but he had to. His leg was nothing but a momentary distraction from the unfortunate situation that he was in. It only took a single howl for him to remember it was still coming. He shot his glance upwards, back the way that he'd come down the row of endless corn. Down at ground level, he could see quite a ways, and to his excitement, he didn't see anything. Only the rows and rows of corn greeted his gaze. He couldn't hear it anymore, either. The crows had stopped their incessant cawing, and the breeze had died and silenced the rustling of the stalks. The silence should have filled him with comfort, and it did for a brief moment. For an even briefer moment, he wondered if maybe he'd imagined the thing. Its voice, its call. Maybe it wasn't coming? But then the silence really set in. It was painfully heavy, collapsing in around him and squeezing his lungs. His breath hurried, trying to compensate. This wasn't natural. He realized that the silence meant that the thing could be anywhere. Maybe he couldn't hear it coming because it was already upon him, watching from somewhere close by. That weight was lifted by the closer, second call. That thing was definitely real, and now it was coming for him, and he couldn't move. He felt warm tears as he tried to think. Walking was out of the question, but he knew that if he stayed here, it would have him. Whatever it wasn't going to just give up or lose him. It knew that he was in this field. It was coming. That was all that was certain now. So the boy decided he had to do the only thing left to do. He started to crawl. He dragged himself across the rough, stalk-laden dirt up the corn rows towards the afternoon sun. Every time he dug his raw, scratched elbows into the dirt, it made him wince and gasp, but he had to push past it. He was tough, just like Daddy had taught him. He had to be tough. So he moved forward, ever so slowly, but constantly. His spirit wasn't gone, not yet, and he was determined. He wasn't exactly hopeful, for he knew in his heart that there was no way. He was sure of it. There was no way he could carry himself out of this field before it had found him. It would take him. It was this slow, drowning realization that seemed to add 50 pounds to his small body and pull the fight right out of him. There was no way. And as he again began to weep, he heard it. A rustling from the distance behind him, only audible because of the dead silence in the air. At first he thought it was something small, a bird, the return of the breeze, or at least that's what he hoped. He hoped that it was anything that wasn't that thing, but of course it wasn't the wind. It wasn't a bird. Something was moving through the cornstalks, and fast. He turned unwillingly as he lay there. For the longest time, seconds in reality, but minutes in his racing mind, he watched. The row remained as silent as it was, empty, nothing to be seen, as it should be. Then the foot came out of nowhere. He'd blinked right as it emerged from the row to his left, more than 70 yards away. It had emerged, and then, before the boy knew it, it had propelled the slender black thing sideways across the row. The corn shook in its wake. It took about 10 seconds before he saw it ruin his view again, this time one more row forward, one row closer. It was moving towards him, sweeping from side to side. There was no hiding from it, and the boy knew it. The boy, finally freed from his fear, noticed that a small rogue batch of corn grew a little thicker just to his left across one of the columns. Perhaps, just perhaps, he would be less noticeable in there. At least that's what his frightened mind told him. The corn had to help, because it couldn't possibly hurt. The child moved his body into the small patch, and there he could only ball up and prepare. He'd heard the cracking as the thing raced through the fields. Its hunt was ongoing, and it would soon come to its grisly conclusion. He used all of his will to keep from making a single sound even as he wept. It would overlook him, he hoped. It would just pass him by. He bit his lip and wished that he could wake up. Then it happened. The boy heard him and his eyes widened, but this time it was in astonishment and disbelief. A quick smile crossed his cheeks as the warm sound came to his ears. Hope tightened inside him like a bonfire, and he turned. "Johnny!" He heard his father and his father's friends calling his name. They must have heard his earlier yelling from before his fall, and they were now coming to him. In that single moment, never had he felt more relieved. His father calling to him was the greatest sound that he'd ever heard. Hope returned to the boy. And again, this happiness was overtaken by that thing. It had halted, if only for a moment, at the voices of the approaching farmers, and he saw it do so. Its form obscured by the corn, halted and turned its nightmarish visage towards the boy's father. For a moment, the boy had another fear. What if the thing went for his dad? Did he have his gun? Could he defend himself? Would it hurt the man? He swore the thing would dart straight through the fields, turning all of its focus to his father, but instead it had begun running again across the rows, faster than it had been before. It was speeding up. It had turned its full attention to finding and collecting the child, back to hunting him. Then came the dilemma. The boy wanted to cry out to his father. He wanted to shout. He wanted to cry. He wanted to scream. But he realized that the only thing that kept whatever that creature was from taking him out right that second was the sole fact that it had no idea where he was. It only knew that he'd started running away, and possibly that he'd fallen. It probably knew that he'd fallen. That's why it was searching the ground. He figured all this in a moment. His father and his father's friends sounded close, closer than that thing, but he couldn't see them. Even if he called to them now, he knew that the chances of the beast reaching him first were very high. Too high for his comfort. He faced forward, and now the creature was only about 50 yards away. He could make out its figure more clearly in the fields. The speed was remarkable, and it was the singular most horrifying thing about this pursuer, its ungodly speed. Turning around, he saw movement in the corn. His father was getting close, almost as close as the thing was on the other end. He was sandwiched in between the two, and he had an important choice to make. So he closed his eyes. In the darkness, all was the same. There was a rustling and a crackling from in front, and the snapping and calling from the rear. That thing and his father. Both were closing in, faster and faster. There was only one thing that he could do to possibly help. Either his father would pick him up and fight the thing off, or it would steal him away, never to be seen again. The choice was made when he turned back around, and he opened his eyes just enough to see his father moving sideways through the field. He had started moving away from his son. His heart sank when his dad disappeared from view, and the creature still came closer. He could only mouth, "No, no, no," and his father and his hope faded from sight. That thing, however, was still coming at him. His fate was sealed. The boy closed his eyes. He knew it would happen. The crunching from in front was nearly upon him, and his father's voice grew slightly fainter. He clenched his teeth. There was the final irrational thought that maybe it would miss him. Maybe. But then it was too much to risk. There was only one thing that he could do, a final act of pure desperation. The child called out, and they heard. They all heard. One thing that's always frustrated me about life is when it comes down to it, it's never an easy choice, is it? Never cut and dried. That's why I like fiction. Stay scary, my wildlings, and make the most of your nights.